My memories of Lackland Air Force Base are more akin to ghost stories than to tales of valor or camaraderie. Even now, years after my discharge, the images haunt me in the stillness of the night, as vivid and chilling as if I were still there, standing in the shadows of that decrepit building designated for Flight 616. It was there, in that forsaken place, that my journey began, a journey marred by fear and veiled in secrecy. The building itself seemed to groan under the weight of its own decay, the walls peeling and the air stale with the scent of mold and sweat. This was where we, the unlucky chosen of Flight 616, were isolated from the rest of the trainees. It wasn't just the physical isolation that clawed at our spirits. It was the oppressive atmosphere, thick with dread, that enveloped us. Drill Sergeant Ramsey was our overseer, our tormentor. From the moment he walked into our lives, the air shifted, denser, more suffocating. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a voice that could make the sturdiest walls tremble. His training methods were not just harsh. They were cruel. With a sneer permanently etched on his face, he took pleasure in our suffering, his jokes about dire outcomes leaving us unsure whether we feared failure or him more. I wasn't alone in my struggles, though the feeling of solitude was ever present. My partner, a young man whose incompetence was as consistent as the sunrise, became both my burden and my only ally. We were paired often, his mistakes making our already grueling tasks even more challenging. Each failure on his part felt like a weight added to my own load, yet facing the wrath of DS Ramsey alone would have been far worse. The base itself was a labyrinth of pain and challenge. Among these, the most notorious was Hell's Mile, a rigorous course through the woods designed to break us physically and mentally. We heard about it on our first day, whispered amongst the trainees with a mix of fear and anticipation. The course was littered with obstacles that were as much psychological as they were physical, a true testament to the base's brutal legacy. As we stood at the edge of the woods, the dim light barely piercing the canopy, I could almost sense the shadows moving, hear the whispers of those who had tread this path before us. The stories varied from person to person, some speaking of unexplained noises, others of shadows that seemed too human to be merely tricks of the light. But we were yet to learn the full truth of Hell's Mile. That first night, as I lay on my thin mattress, the darkness was a canvas for my fears. Every creak and groan of the building seemed to speak, warning us of the hellish days to come. The isolation in that dilapidated building wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a mental one, separating us from reality, from who we once were. Looking back, I realized that the true training at Lackland wasn't about physical strength or tactical prowess. It was a test of our ability to endure, to hold on to our sanity amidst chaos. Even now, I'm not sure I passed that test. As I write this, the memories still pulse vividly in my mind, as real as if I were back in that forsaken building, waiting for the dawn to rescue me from the night's terrors. This is my story, the truth of Flight 616, as real and haunting as the ghosts that linger in the corners of my mind. It's a story I've kept locked away, buried under years of silence. But silence, like the dark, only feeds the ghosts. Maybe, just maybe, it's time to let the light in. The first real taste of Drill Sergeant Ramsey's regime came not with a gradual buildup, but as a sudden, brutal shock. From the moment we were roused before dawn by his barking orders, it became clear that our time in Flight 616 would be a relentless trial by fire. As we lined up in the chilly morning air, our bodies tense and our minds fogged by sleep, Ramsey's silhouette loomed like a specter of the upcoming torment. His training methods were unorthodox, to say the least. Physical abuse was cloaked under the guise of discipline. Psychological tactics were employed not just to toughen us, but to break us down. Push-ups, sprints, and obstacle courses were interspersed with stinging verbal assaults and menacing threats. He watched with a hawk's eye, and every slip, every falter was met with disproportionate consequences. As the days wore on, the strain began to manifest not only physically but mentally. My own internal conflict grew each day. Doubts crept into my thoughts like unwelcome shadows, whispering questions I dared not voice aloud. Was this normal? Were all military training experiences like this? Or had we, somehow, been singled out for this cruel fate? The Hell's Mile was introduced to us as part of our daily routine. The name was apt. The course was a brutal stretch through dense woodland, peppered with obstacles that seemed designed more for injury than training. It was here that the physical and psychological challenges combined to create a grueling gauntlet. As we crawled, climbed, and ran, the woods around us felt alive, as if watching and whispering at our feeble attempts to conquer the challenges set before us. Ramsey's presence was always nearby, his voice cutting through the sounds of labored breaths and rustling leaves. "You think this is hard? It's only the beginning," he would shout, a grim prophecy rather than motivation. His training pushed us beyond our limits, testing not just our bodies but the very fiber of our beings. One particularly harrowing day, after a series of punishing exercises, my partner faltered badly. His mistake during a timed obstacle run cost us both dearly. As punishment, Ramsey forced us to repeat the course, not once but several times, each iteration more exhausting and demoralizing than the last. My partner's apologetic glances were met with my frustrated, yet sympathetic nods. We were in this nightmare together, after all. The evening debriefings were no respite. They were psychological games designed to pit us against each other, to unearth any hint of weakness. Ramsey's tactics sowed distrust and fear among us, turning potential allies into wary competitors. His inappropriate jokes about our potential fates left us not only fearing failure but deeply unnervated about what lay ahead. It was during one of these sessions that I first heard whispers of trainees who had supposedly been part of Flight 616 before us and had vanished. Kicked out, or worse, they said, voices hushed as though the very walls might report back to Ramsey. The uncertainty of their fates hung over us like a dark cloud, feeding our fears with every cryptic smirk Ramsey threw our way. As I lay in my bunk at night, the day's horrors replaying in my mind, the whispers of the past seemed to merge with the rustling of the leaves outside. Was I hearing things, or were the whispers real? The line between reality and my fraying sanity blurred further with each passing day. This was the beginning of our descent into hell, a journey that promised no return, only deeper into the shadows that seemed to close in around us with Ramsey's every word. As the weeks progressed, the grueling regimen under Drill Sergeant Ramsey's watch did not just test our physical limits. It seemed to erode the very essence of who we were. Amidst the relentless drills and the degrading challenges, an unsettling pattern began to emerge, one that spoke of deeper, darker secrets than any of us had dared to imagine. The first indication that something was amiss came subtly. A trainee from our unit, who had been particularly targeted by Ramsey for his slower pace, was suddenly gone. No explanation, no farewell. His bed was stripped and his locker emptied as if he had never existed. This disappearance was the first, but it was not the last. Each vanishing seemed to occur just as a trainee reached their breaking point, a grim outcome that left us whispering in the shadows, speculating about their fates. The fear among us grew palpable, a thick, choking terror that we breathed in with the dust and sweat of the training grounds. The paranoia that someone might next be erased from existence without a trace added a psychological torment to our already strenuous days. It was in this atmosphere of dread that Ramsey's punishments grew even more severe, his jokes about disappearing failures cutting more deeply than the cold edge of the morning air. One afternoon, as we trudged back from Hell's Mile, our uniforms caked in mud and our bodies aching from the exertion, a fellow trainee whispered to me a rumor he had heard. According to hushed tales, those who disappeared were not transferred or discharged honorably. They were part of something far more sinister, something that Ramsey had orchestrated in the depths of those very woods. As the days shortened and the nights grew longer, the woods around us seemed to close in, becoming a living entity watching our every move. During a night navigation exercise, My partner and I stumbled upon an area that felt unnaturally cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. We thought we saw shadows flitting between the trees, too human to be mere tricks of the light, too silent to be real. Fear rooted us to the spot until a distant call from our instructor pushed us onward, the chilling encounter lingering in our minds. Our training continued, each day blending into the next with exhausting monotony, punctuated by bursts of adrenaline-fueled fear. One particularly eerie twilight, I experienced what I first thought was a hallucination. We were practicing tactical maneuvers when I suddenly found myself alone, my squad nowhere in sight. Panic gripped me as the forest seemed to whisper my name, the trees rustling as though speaking in hushed, conspiratorial tones. Just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed, and my squad reappeared, laughing off my fears as the fog of exhaustion clouded my judgment. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural was at play, something that connected the whispered rumors to the oppressive atmosphere of our training environment. The impact of these experiences was profound. Each whispered rumor and unexplained occurrence wove itself into the fabric of our daily existence, intertwining fear with routine until it was impossible to separate the two. We trained harder, driven not just by the desire to succeed, but by the urgent need to avoid becoming another ghost of Flight 616. Lying awake at night, the day's fears would replay in my mind, each shadow and whisper amplifying my terror. I began to realize that the true challenge of Flight 616 was not the physical obstacles or the harsh discipline. It was surviving the psychological warfare waged by Ramsey and the haunting uncertainty of whether we were training for war or being prepared for something far worse. As I drifted into uneasy sleep, the line between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving me to wonder if I would wake in my bunk or vanish like the whispers in the wind. As the weeks melted into a seamless parade of torment and exhaustion, the relentless pace set by Drill Sergeant Ramsey pushed us all to the brink. Each day, the boundary of our mental endurance stretched thinner, marked by the sweat of our brows and the soil of our uniforms, as we tackled the grueling tasks set before us. The ever-present specter of becoming another one of Flight 616's vanishing trainees loomed over us, urging us forward with a morbid fear that was almost palpable. One fateful day stood out starkly, a day when the strains of training and the psychological burden of our situation converged into a singular, harrowing climax. It was on a soggy morning, the ground muddy from the night's rain, making the obstacle courses especially treacherous. My partner and I, already worn from the constant pressure and sleepless nights, faced what would become our most formidable challenge yet. As we approached the final segment of an obstacle course, a crawl under barbed wire with live rounds cracking overhead, my partner made a critical error. His foot caught on a wire, sending a sharp jangle through the air, louder than the gunfire. The mistake was minor, but in Ramsey's domain, even minor errors had major repercussions. His punishment was swift and severe. We were to start the entire course over, our exhausted bodies protesting every movement. The repeated failures, driven by fatigue and Ramsey's merciless discipline, broke down whatever camaraderie might have existed among us. The whispers about the vanished trainees grew darker, more desperate. They were not just cautionary tales anymore. They were potential fates that any of us could meet if we failed to meet Ramsey's impossible standards. Amidst these trials, the climax of our horror came unexpectedly. It was during another attempt to navigate the dreaded Hell's Mile when I stumbled upon a chilling scene. Hidden in a thicket, away from the usual paths, I found objects that looked disturbingly like mannequins at first glance. But as I drew closer, the grotesque truth revealed itself. They were not mannequins, but the bodies of trainees, their uniforms still on, faces I recognized, but could no longer name, positioned as if still participating in training exercises. The discovery shook me to my core. My entire body trembled, not from the cold, but from a deep, chilling horror that seeped into my bones. The implications were monstrous, unimaginable. Had these trainees been discarded here, used for some macabre purpose? The thought was too horrifying to entertain, yet impossible to dismiss. Isolated, both physically and mentally, the woods around me seemed to close in, the trees whispering secrets I was not meant to hear. I wanted to scream, to run, but my training kicked in. I knew I had to return to my unit, to pretend I had seen nothing. The fear of what might happen if I revealed my discovery kept me silent. The burden of what I had found weighed heavily on me in the days that followed. My interactions with Ramsay became strained, each glance carrying with it a silent question. Did he know that I knew? The environment of fear and suspicion Ramsay had cultivated reached its zenith, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, no longer certain of who I could trust. As the final week of training approached, the internal struggle within me grew. The mental breakdown that threatened each of us seemed imminent for me. Sleep became elusive, filled with nightmares of being chased through the woods by faceless figures. My waking hours were no less torturous, marked by jumpiness and an acute sense of paranoia. Reflecting on that time, it is clear that the true test of Flight 616 was not about surviving the physical trials but surviving the psychological warfare that was waged upon us. It was about enduring the breaking of spirits and bodies and coming out intact on the other side. As I lay in my bunk each night, listening to the sounds of the base, the real and the imagined began to merge, and I wondered if I would ever find my way back to who I was before Flight 616. The final test of our basic training was upon us, a culmination of all the trials and torments that had chipped away at our resolve over the previous weeks. This test was not merely about physical endurance or tactical skill. It was about survival, about clinging to the last shreds of our humanity in the face of overwhelming darkness. As dawn broke on the day of the final obstacle course, the air was thick with tension, each of us aware that the horrors we had endured were building to this climax. The course was set with a cruel precision, designed to push us beyond our limits. The most daunting task was the barbed wire crawl, a brutal stretch that forced us close to the earth, as if to remind us of our mortality. The ground was cold and unforgiving, the sharp edges of the wire looming ominously above us. My partner and I approached the obstacle with a grim determination, our bodies bruised and battered from weeks of relentless training. We dove into the mud, the wire scraping against our backs with every movement. But within moments, a simple mistake by my partner, a snag of his uniform on the wire, set us back to the beginning. The frustration was palpable, our breaths heavy in the chilly morning air. Each restart was a blow to our spirits, the physical pain compounded by the psychological strain of knowing that failure here could mean more than just a restart. It could spell the end of our time in Flight 616, one way or another. With each attempt, our movements became more desperate, less coordinated. The exhaustion that clung to us like the mud on our uniforms was more than physical. It was the exhaustion of souls worn thin by fear and brutality. And yet, amidst this despair, a surreal sense of camaraderie began to emerge between us, a shared resolve to not let this final challenge defeat us. It was during one of these attempts, as we crawled under the wire, the sounds of our fellow trainees' struggles around us, that my mind began to slip. The edges of reality blurred, and for a moment, I was no longer in the training field at Lackland, but in some nightmarish landscape where the shadows of my former comrades reached out to me. They whispered not words of encouragement, but warnings, their voices tinged with the pain of their untimely fates. Shaking off the hallucinations, I focused on the voice of my partner urging me on, pulling me back to the harsh reality of the mud and the wire. Together, we pushed through the final stretch, our bodies screaming in protest, until we emerged on the other side, gasping for breath, covered in mud but victorious in our own small way. The relief was short-lived, however, as the realization settled in that we had only survived, not conquered. The shadows of the fallen seemed to linger around us, a grim reminder of what could have awaited us had we failed. The line between the living and the lost felt perilously thin, and as we regrouped with the rest of Flight 616, the bonds that held us were strained, marked by the unspoken knowledge of what we had endured. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the day's events replayed endlessly in my mind. The faces of those I thought I had seen in my hallucinations haunted me, their eyes filled with an unspoken plea for recognition, for remembrance. It was a night of restless sleep, where every shadow and every noise seemed to carry a message from those who had not made it through. Reflecting on the ordeal, it became clear that this final test was less about training us to be soldiers and more about seeing how much we could endure before breaking completely. It was a test of our ability to face our deepest fears, to keep moving forward even when every instinct screamed to stop, to retreat. And as the first rays of dawn crept into the barracks, lighting up the faces of my fellow trainees, I realized that we had all been changed, irrevocably, by the longest night of our lives. The end of basic training did not bring the relief I had imagined. Instead, there lingered a heavy silence, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of secrets we were all forced to bear. After the final test, as we stood lined up in the crisp morning air, receiving our passing remarks from Drill Sergeant Ramsey, the gaze I met in his eyes was piercing, almost accusing. Did he suspect that I knew about the dark underbelly of Flight 616? Or was he simply scrutinizing us, wondering if any of us would break the silence? In the days that followed, the base slowly returned to its routine, but for us, nothing felt the same. There was an eerie calm, a deceptive peace that hung over us like a fog. I found myself grappling with the decision to stay silent about what I had discovered. Speaking out seemed impossible. How could I expose the horrors without endangering myself or doubting my own sanity? The fear of retribution was palpable, and the potential consequences of breaking that silence loomed large. My struggle with maintaining another trainee's identity became a daily battle. I had assumed his identity in an act of desperation during the final weeks of training, a decision made in a moment of sheer survival instinct. Living under an assumed name, even just within the confines of the base, added another layer of isolation to my already heavy burden. The fear of being discovered, of having to explain why I had taken such drastic measures, was constant and consuming. The isolation was not just physical, it was profoundly psychological. I felt detached from my fellow trainees, from the very person I used to be before joining Flight 616. The camaraderie that usually binds soldiers together had been eroded by the secrets we carried, each of us isolated in our own silent turmoil. As I moved through my days, the faces of the trainees who had not made it haunted me. In every shadow, I saw their silhouettes. In every silence, I heard their whispers. The base, once a place of discipline and structure, now felt like a mausoleum, each corner holding echoes of the lost. My decision to keep the secrets of Flight 616 was solidified one evening during a conversation with a fellow trainee, one who had been particularly close to one of the vanished. He spoke of his friend in the past tense, his voice low and his eyes hollow. "It's better not to ask, not to know," he said, a sentiment that chilled me to the bone. It was then I realized that the truth might indeed be more dangerous than the secrets we kept. In the quiet hours of the night, I would often reflect on the enormity of what we had endured. The training, the fear, the disappearances, they had all been part of a larger, more sinister plan, one that we had only glimpsed the edges of. The full scope of Ramsey's intentions remained shrouded in mystery, and perhaps it was better that way. As my time at the base drew to a close, I prepared to leave, knowing that the shadows of Flight 616 would likely follow me. I was being discharged under the identity I had assumed, carrying with me the credentials and the history of another man. The reality of this new identity was a stark reminder of how far I had come from the eager recruit who first stepped onto Lackland Air Force Base. On my last night, as I packed my few belongings, the weight of my experiences felt both heavy and unreal. I was leaving, but the part of me that had survived Flight 616 would remain forever entwined with the ghosts of those who had not. The silence I chose to keep was not just a shield but a shroud, covering the darkest truths of what it meant to be a part of that ill-fated flight. As I stepped off the base for the last time, the early morning mist enveloping me, I wondered if the sun would ever truly dispel the darkness that Flight 616 had cast over my life. The years following my departure from Lackland Air Force Base were marked by a lingering shadow that colored every aspect of my life. As a veteran, I found that the typical narratives of service and sacrifice did not fully encapsulate the haunting experiences of Flight 616. There was no heroism in silence, no honor in the secrets I carried. Instead, there was a deep-seated unease that followed me into civilian life, a constant reminder of what I had endured and the truths I had chosen to conceal. Integrating back into society was a challenge. The faces of strangers often morphed into those of the comrades whose fates had been so cruelly twisted by the machinations at Lackland. Nightmares frequently disturbed my sleep, vivid replays of the grueling training and the harrowing discoveries in the woods. These were not just memories. They were vivid, invasive recollections that refused to be relegated to the past. The decision to remain silent about the true nature of my training haunted me. It was a decision born out of fear and survival, but as the years passed, the weight of that silence grew heavier. It became a barrier between myself and the world, a hidden scar that marked me as different, separate, alone in my experiences. Throughout my career, I maintained the identity I had assumed during those final weeks of training. It was a protective guise, one that shielded me from questions and prevented the real story of Flight 616 from surfacing. But with each passing year, the burden of living a lie strained my sense of self, eroding the person I had been before I became a soldier. My interactions with other veterans often felt hollow. While they shared stories of their service, I held back the darkest parts of mine, fearing that my truths would be too outlandish, too horrifying to be believed. This reticence isolated me, creating a chasm between me and those who might have understood the toll of service. Eventually, the need to reconcile my past with my present became overwhelming. The silent whispers of my fallen comrades, the ghostly echoes of their unspoken stories, compelled me to finally break my silence. It was a decision that came not out of a moment of courage, but from a profound need for release, for peace. I began to document my experiences, initially as a personal catharsis, a way to exorcise the ghosts that had haunted me for so long. As I wrote, the details of those harrowing weeks flowed onto the page with a clarity that surprised me. The act of writing became a bridge between my internal world and the external reality, a means of bringing the hidden shadows into the light. The process of telling my story was painstaking and painful. Each word, each sentence, brought with it a resurgence of the fears and traumas I had endured. But with each chapter completed, I felt a lightness, as if the heavy armor I had worn for so long was slowly being dismantled, piece by piece. As the manuscript neared completion, I grappled with the decision to publish it. Exposing the dark underbelly of military training, the corruption and cruelty that had marked Flight 616, was risky. It could lead to disbelief, backlash, or worse. But the alternative, continuing to live in the shadows of untold truths, was no longer bearable. Reflecting on my journey, I recognize now that the story of Flight 616 is more than just a personal narrative. It is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, a chronicle of survival against unimaginable odds. As I prepare to share my story with the world, I do so with a mixture of fear and resolve, hopeful that in telling it, the ghosts of my past might finally find rest, and perhaps, just perhaps, the light of understanding will clear the shadows they left behind.